All right, so get ready, because today we're doing a deep dive on a topic that might be a little controversial.
Yeah.
Anarchy.
Mhm.
Now, I know what you're thinking, right?
Yeah.
Chaos, Molotov cocktails,
Yeah.
the whole 9 yards.
Right.
But hold on, because this exploration might just turn that image on its head.
Yeah.
We're going to go beyond those sensational headlines and dive deep into the philosophy behind it all.
It really is fascinating how anarchy has become almost synonymous with chaos.
Yeah.
People use it as a way to shut down any conversation about alternative ways of organizing society.
Right.
But if we look past all the emotional baggage and just go back to the actual definition, without a ruler, it really opens up a whole world of possibilities.
Absolutely. And to help us navigate this world, we've got an expert who can shed some light on the nuances of anarchy, and particularly as it's presented in Stefan Molyneux's book, Everyday Anarchy.
Yeah, Molyneux is a controversial figure, no doubt.
For sure.
He's been accused of promoting extreme views, even flirting with the alt-right. But regardless of where you stand on his politics, his book really does raise some important questions about the nature of power, the role of government, and the possibilities for self-organization.
So let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Molyneux argues that anarchy, at its core, is about voluntary interaction.
Right.
It's not about the absence of rules,
Right.
but rather the absence of a ruler who dictates those rules.
Exactly.
And he makes the point that we actually already live in a state of anarchy in many aspects of our personal lives.
Think about it. Choosing a partner.
Oh, yeah.
Deciding whether to have children, pursuing a career path.
Right.
These are all deeply personal decisions that we make without government intervention.
Totally.
Imagine if the state told you who you could marry.
Oh, scary.
Or what job you had to take.
Right. It would be a nightmare.
It would be a nightmare.
It really makes you appreciate the freedom that we often take for granted, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Begs the question, if we're out comfortable with anarchy in these areas of our lives, why are we so resistant to the idea of it on a larger scale?
I think part of it is the fear of the unknown, right? The idea that without a strong central authority, society would just descend into chaos.
Right.
But history shows us that this fear is often misplaced.
Yeah.
In fact, there are plenty of examples of societies that function effectively.
For sure.
Without a centralized state, often for extended periods.
Yeah. One of the most striking examples that Molyneux uses is that comparison of deaths caused by anarchists versus deaths caused by governments in the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
Really puts things into perspective.
The numbers are absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
Governments, even democratically elected ones, were responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths in the 20th century alone through wars, famines, political repression.
Right.
And in contrast, the number of deaths attributed to anarchists is minuscule.
It makes you wonder if our fear of anarchy isn't more about propaganda than actual historical evidence.
That's a key point that Molyneux makes throughout the book. He argues that the state has a vested interest in perpetuating the myth of the dangerous anarchist, the chaos-loving bomb thrower, to justify its own existence and its monopoly on force.
And he uses the example of the robber barons to illustrate this point.
Right.
Now, I know that that term has become synonymous with corporate greed and exploitation.
Right.
But Molyneux presents a different perspective.
The popular narrative is that these industrialists amass their wealth through ruthless tactics, exploiting workers and crushing competition.
Right.
But if we look closer, we see that many of them actually lowered prices for consumers and provided valuable goods and services that improved people's lives.
So if these robber barons were so bad for consumers, why were they the ones pushing for government regulation?
That's the key question that Molyneux asks. He argues that it was often their competitors, those who couldn't keep up in a free market, who lobbied the government for protection. They used the state to stifle competition and protect their own interests, often at the expense of consumers.
It's a classic example of how the narrative of protecting the people can be used to mask self-serving motives.
Exactly.
And it raises the question, how often does this happen?
Right.
Are there other areas where we've been conditioned to accept government intervention as necessary, when in reality it might be doing more harm than good?
Molyneux argues that this pattern repeats itself in areas like education, healthcare, and welfare programs.
Okay.
He contends that these systems, while often presented as solutions to social problems, can actually exacerbate those problems by creating dependencies and disincentivizing innovation.
He uses the problem of the commons to illustrate this point.
Yeah.
This is the idea that shared resources, like public parks or fisheries, will inevitably be overused and depleted without government regulation.
It's a compelling argument on the surface, but Molyneux points out a flaw in the logic. He asks, if people are inherently incapable of managing shared resources responsibly, how can we possibly trust them to choose wise leaders? Isn't a government, with its vast power and resources, just the ultimate commons?
Yeah, it's like saying, I don't trust you to handle your own finances, so I'm going to give you control over everyone else's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a contradictory argument that ultimately serves to justify expanding the power of the state. And it's particularly ironic when you apply it to the issue of monopolies.
Because the proposed solution to a supposedly dangerous free market monopoly is often a government monopoly, which is inherently coercive.
Like fighting fire with a bigger, more destructive fire makes you wonder if the cure might be worse than the disease.
So we talked about the fear of anarchy, the historical record, and the critique of government intervention. But what about democracy? Isn't that the ultimate expression of the people's will? Surely, if people truly wanted anarchy, they would vote for it.
Well, Molyneux argues that our relationship with democracy is a lot more complicated than that. He points out that we often use democracy as a shield to avoid confronting the contradictions in our own beliefs about individual freedom and collective responsibility.
We want the benefits of a caring society without acknowledging the coercive means often used to achieve them.
Take welfare programs, for example. If democracy truly reflects the will of the people, and those people genuinely care about helping the poor, wouldn't they be willing to do so voluntarily without government coercion?
It seems like he's suggesting that we use democracy as a way to justify actions we might not be comfortable with if we had to take individual responsibility for them.
And this leads us to perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of anarchy, the question of violence. It's something that we often associate with anarchy, but rarely acknowledge as being inherent in the very nature of the state itself.
It's the elephant in the room, for sure. Yeah, it's hard to talk about anarchy without addressing the issue of force. Especially when you consider that taxation, the foundation of any government, is inherently an act of initiating force.
Molyneux makes this point by comparing taxation to theft. Both involve the taking of property without consent, but one is considered a crime, while the other is considered a civic duty.
So we condemn the mugger who steals your wallet, but accept the government taking a portion of your income under threat of imprisonment.
Molyneux argues that we've been conditioned to accept this double standard because we've bought into the myth that the state is necessary for our protection. But he uses the analogy of being kidnapped and told it's for your own safety.
Yeah, it highlights the absurdity of the argument, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And this dissonance becomes even more apparent when you consider the violence inherent in war.
Molyneux argues that the true violence of war isn't just on the battlefield, it's at home. Wars are funded by taxation, which is ultimately backed by the threat of force against citizens.
He compares it to examining the psychology of lottery players without ever mentioning the prize money.
It's missing the most crucial element of the equation. Without the ability to compel citizens to fund wars through taxation or borrowing, which is essentially deferred taxation. War itself would be impossible on the scale we've seen in the 20th and 21st centuries.
So it seems like Molyneux is suggesting that the state's claim to protect its citizens is inherently contradictory.
Because it relies on violence against those very citizens to fund its operations, including its military.
It's a sobering thought, for sure.
It is.
And it raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions.
For sure.
About the nature of power, the legitimacy of the state, and the potential for alternative ways of organizing society.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Stay tuned, because in part 2 of our deep dive into everyday anarchy, we'll explore the social and professional implications of embracing this radical philosophy. We'll also delve into potential solutions for law enforcement and national defense in a stateless society.
So buckle up, because things are about to get really interesting.
They are.
All right, we'll see you next time. Welcome back to our deep dive into everyday anarchy. Last time we were exploring Stefan Molyneux's critique of government and the inherent violence of the state. But now let's shift gears a little bit and tackle a common criticism of anarchy.
Okay.
Is that fear that without a government, society would just descend into chaos.
Right.
Like the classic Lord of the Flies scenario, right?
Yeah.
Everyone turns on each other the minute there's no one in charge.
It's a common concern.
Yeah.
But Molyneux challenges this assumption by highlighting all the countless examples of voluntary cooperation and self-organization that exist in our daily lives, even within systems that rely on government oversight.
So it's like, if these systems can function based on a certain level of trust and voluntary compliance, maybe we're selling ourselves short on our capacity for creating order without resorting to force.
Precisely.
Okay.
Molyneux argues that we actually possess a natural inclination towards self-governance that often goes unnoticed. And he uses the example of academia.
Okay.
Think about it. Universities are filled with brilliant minds. Often with very strong opinions. And sometimes clashing egos.
For sure.
Yet somehow these institutions manage to function without descending into chaos.
They have their own hierarchies, peer review processes, standards for publication.
Exactly.
It's a complex system, but it operates based on this shared understanding of the rules. Even though those rules aren't necessarily codified into law.
Exactly. And this principle extends beyond academia.
Okay.
Think about all the voluntary organizations and initiatives that thrive in our society. Charities, community groups, professional associations, online communities. These groups often achieve remarkable results without relying on government mandates.
So is Molyneux suggesting that a stateless society wouldn't just be a free-for-all? That our fear of societal collapse without a government might be overblown?
That's a key takeaway from everyday anarchy.
Okay.
He's not arguing for some utopian vision where conflict just disappears.
Right.
But he is suggesting that we might be underestimating our ability to solve problems and create order through voluntary cooperation. He believes that the problem of the commons is more a problem of perception than of human nature.
It's like assuming a football game would just devolve into utter mayhem without a referee. But players, for the most part, follow the rules. Because it's in their best interest.
Exactly.
They want a fair and competitive game, and they understand that breaking the rules leads to penalties.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the importance of incentives. In shaping behavior.
For sure.
In a free market, people are driven by self-interest. But that self-interest isn't inherently opposed to the collective good. In fact, they can often align.
Because in a truly free market, businesses are incentivized to provide quality goods and services at a fair price. To attract customers. And in a stateless society, where individuals are responsible for their own security, there's a strong incentive to cooperate.
For sure.
And build a reputation for trustworthiness.
It's a fascinating shift in perspective. Instead of viewing anarchy as a recipe for chaos, we can start to see it as a system. Where cooperation emerges not through coercion, but through mutual benefit and self-interest.
Okay, let's say we accept the premise that people can cooperate without being forced to.
Okay.
How would a stateless society actually function in practice? What about those functions that we typically associate with governments? Like law enforcement and national defense.
Everyday anarchy doesn't offer a detailed blueprint for a stateless society.
Okay.
Molyneux acknowledges the complex challenges involved. But he does present some thought-provoking ideas about how these functions might be addressed without resorting to state power.
So let's dive into some of those potential solutions. Starting with law enforcement. How do you maintain order and protect people from violence without a traditional police force?
Molyneux points to the historical existence of private security firms and arbitration services as potential alternatives. He argues that a free market would see a demand for these services, and competition would drive innovation and efficiency.
So instead of a centralized police force, you might have a network of competing security providers. Similar to choosing a cable provider or a cell phone plan, individuals and communities could choose the provider that best meets their needs and values.
It's an interesting idea. This approach could lead to a more customized approach to security, where different communities tailor their systems to their specific priorities.
It also addresses concerns about the accountability and potential for abuse of power that often plague government-run police forces.
Exactly. In a competitive market, security providers would be incentivized to build a reputation for trustworthiness and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Unethical or abusive practices would lead to customer loss and potential legal repercussions.
It's like choosing a babysitter.
Exactly.
You want someone reliable, trustworthy, someone recommended by people you trust.
This model emphasizes reputation and accountability over blind faith and authority.
Right.
It's worth noting that even today,
Yeah.
private security plays a significant role in areas like protecting businesses and gated communities.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about national defense?
Right.
How can a stateless society protect itself from external threats without a standing army?
This is where things get a bit more speculative.
Yeah.
And Molyneux admits there are no easy answers.
Okay.
However, he does point to historical examples of societies that defended themselves effectively without relying on a traditional military structure. He mentions Switzerland, for example, which has a long tradition of armed neutrality and relies on a system of citizen militias.
And there's Iceland, which has no standing army and depends on international agreements and diplomatic relations for its defense.
Right.
So Molyneux suggests a stateless society might employ various strategies.
Yeah.
Like voluntary militias, collective defense agreements, and a strong emphasis on diplomacy and conflict resolution.
It's a multifaceted approach that acknowledges the complex nature of security in a world where nation-states aren't the only players.
This brings up an important question, though.
Okay.
If you have all these private security forces and voluntary militias, how do you prevent them from turning on each other? Or becoming the very tyrants they're supposed to protect us from?
Right.
Isn't that a recipe for warlordism?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And one that Molyneux addresses.
Okay.
He argues that the power dynamics in a stateless society would be fundamentally different. Instead of a single centralized entity with a monopoly on force, you'd have a decentralized network of competing powers.
So it's like a system of checks and balances, but on a much larger scale?
Precisely.
Okay.
The idea is that no single group could amass enough power to dominate everyone else. There would always be competing interests and shifting alliances.
Kind of like the ecosystem of a forest, where different species compete for resources.
Yeah.
But there's a natural balance that prevents any one species from taking over completely.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It suggests that the very complexity of a stateless society could be its strength, making it more resilient and less susceptible to tyranny.
But wouldn't this require a high level of trust and cooperation between these competing groups?
It would.
Is that realistic?
Right.
Given our understanding of human nature.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we'll be exploring in more depth. In part 3 of our deep dive.
That's right. Stay tuned, because next time we'll be looking at the philosophical underpinnings of anarchy. The role of morality in a stateless society. And whether a system based on voluntary cooperation can truly stand the test of time. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into everyday anarchy.
It's been a journey.
It has. We've tackled some really tough questions about the nature of government, the potential for a stateless society, and even that sticky issue of violence.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
It is. And now we arrive at the heart of it all. Can a system built on voluntary cooperation actually work?
The big question.
It is the big question.
Yeah.
Can it handle the realities of human nature, the potential for conflict, the sheer complexity of coordinating a society without a central authority?
Yeah, that's what makes a lot of people skeptical.
It is. Anarchy sounds nice in theory, but people can be messy.
Oh, yeah.
We lie, we cheat.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do much worse.
Right.
Can we really build a stable and just society without some form of coercion?
Molyneux doesn't shy away from that in Everyday Anarchy. He acknowledges the darker side of human nature. And actually argues that recognizing it is crucial to designing a system that can truly work.
So we're not talking about some utopian vision where everyone suddenly becomes a saint?
No, not at all. It's about understanding that self-interest is a powerful driver. But it can be channeled in ways that benefit both the individual and the community.
He uses the example of the free market again.
Right, exactly.
Competition, while driven by self-interest, can lead to innovation and better outcomes for everyone.
The invisible hand at work. Individuals pursuing their own goals under the right conditions can create a more efficient and productive system than a centrally planned one.
But how do you apply that principle to something as complex as an entire society.
Right.
Especially when it comes to morals and justice.
Yeah.
Those feel pretty fundamental.
That's where it gets really fascinating.
Okay.
Molyneux argues that in a stateless society, morality can't be imposed from the top down. It has to emerge organically from the way individuals interact.
So instead of laws written by a legislature,
right,
you'd have a set of norms and customs that evolve over time, based on what works for that particular community.
Exactly. He compares it to how languages develop.
Okay.
No one sat down and invented English or Mandarin.
Right.
These languages evolved over centuries through trial and error, adaptation, and constant refinement.
So morality would be less about a rigid set of rules, and more about a shared understanding of right and wrong, specific to that time and place.
It's a more fluid and dynamic approach to ethics, acknowledging that what's considered moral in one context might not be in another.
But wouldn't that lead to chaos? What's to stop groups with different morals from constantly clashing?
Well, that's where reputation becomes paramount.
Okay.
Molyneux argues that in a stateless society, your reputation would be your most valuable asset.
Because it would determine who'd do business with you.
Exactly.
Who'd trust you, be willing to cooperate.
If you gained a reputation for dishonesty, violence, or just being unreliable, you'd find yourself increasingly isolated and cut off from the benefits of that society.
So it creates a kind of self-regulating system.
Right.
People would be incentivized to behave ethically. Not just out of a sense of right and wrong, but to protect their own standing within the community.
It's a system where morality and self-interest intertwine. And it's not entirely foreign to us. Even in our current society, with laws and enforcement, reputation still matters a great deal.
Oh, for sure.
Absolutely.
Think about online reviews. They can make or break a business.
Absolutely. Or social media, where one viral post can damage someone's reputation beyond repair.
Yeah, those are modern-day reputational systems at work.
Exactly.
They show that even without formal laws, there are powerful social and economic forces that can shape behavior.
For sure.
Okay, but what about justice?
Okay.
If someone does something truly wrong in this stateless society, who holds them accountable?
Molyneux suggests that a system of private courts and arbitration could emerge.
Okay.
Individuals could voluntarily agree to use a third-party mediator to resolve disputes.
So instead of a government-run justice system,
Right.
you'd have a marketplace of competing courts and mediators.
It sounds radical, but it actually has some real-world parallels.
Okay.
You see it in private arbitration clauses in contracts.
Yeah.
And the growing use of mediation to resolve legal issues outside of traditional courts.
But wouldn't this system favor the wealthy? They could afford the best lawyers and mediators, putting the poor at a disadvantage.
It's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
However, Molyneux believes that a free market would also create a demand for affordable justice services, and competition would drive down prices, making them more accessible.
And he also sees a role for charitable organizations or mutual aid societies to step in and provide legal support for those who can't afford it.
It's about recognizing that in a stateless society, individuals and communities would need to come up with creative solutions to these challenges.
It's definitely a lot to process.
It is.
I think we're just so accustomed to thinking of government as the solution.
I agree.
That it's tough to imagine these problems being handled in a completely different way.
It requires a major shift in thinking.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that everyday anarchy isn't trying to paint a utopia.
Right.
It's more of a thought experiment, a challenge to our assumptions about how society could be structured.
It's about recognizing that the systems we've created, while they may have been useful at some point, might not be the only way, or even the best way, to organize ourselves.
It invites us to imagine a world where freedom and responsibility are intertwined, where cooperation comes from mutual benefit, and where our potential isn't limited by these rigid systems, but by our own creativity and willingness to challenge the status quo.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us more questions than answers.
As it should.
Yeah.
That's how these things go.
It has, but they're the kind of questions worth wrestling with, I think.
Absolutely.
They make us rethink our assumptions about the world and our place in it.
That's perhaps the most valuable takeaway from everyday anarchy. It's not about handing us a finished blueprint, but about encouraging us to ask better questions, to be more critical of what we take for granted, and to never stop exploring the possibilities for a more just and ethical world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey into everyday anarchy.
My pleasure.
And remember, the exploration doesn't end here.
Keep going.
Keep questioning, keep learning, keep imagining.
Absolutely.
Who knows what we might create if we dare to break free from our current ways of thinking.